Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Value podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Frank Hughes. And today we'll be discussing rhetoric in the Pauline corpus. And in this episode, we're going to mostly focus on the rhetoric in Second Thessalonians, which is regarded by many scholars to be a Deutero-Pauline epistle and was likely composed after Paul's death and not by Paul himself. So thank you for joining me once again, Frank.
Well, my pleasure. This subject brings back a lot of memories for me.
And can you tell us about your work on the rhetoric of Second Thessalonians? You worked on this several decades ago.
Well, yes, I wrote a dissertation on it, and this was the dissertation. And the dissertation at Northwestern University in the joint Garrett Northwestern program was called Second Thessalonians as a Document of Early Christian Rhetoric. And so I wrote it um, in about 82 to 84 and and received the PhD in 1984. And of course, it was directed by Robert Jewett, my distinguished teacher, who disagreed with me. Um, so I was very interested in the rhetoric of all the Pauline letters. Several of us got very interested in rhetoric, in Greco-Roman rhetoric, and trying to figure out how to apply some of the precepts and organizational principles of speeches in Greek and Roman rhetoric to see the extent to which those are applicable to letters. And so basically we everybody who does anything with letters really probably is dependent on Paul Schubert's famous dissertation, The Form and Function of the Pauline Thanksgivings, which was a dissertation that he wrote at the University of Chicago under the great Edgar Goodspeed. That was such an important book that it was published in English in a German series in 1939. That's how important that book was. And what Schubert showed is that the Thanksgiving prayers of Pauline letters were just a standard part of letters. And one of the major things that really the major reason why you had Thanksgiving prayers in these Hellenistic letters is because that is where the person who is writing the letter states the vital theme of the letter. In other words, the theme or themes of the letter will be stated in the Thanksgiving prayer. Um, and Rhetorical criticism of Pauline letters took off from that. And we looked at what Schubert wrote about the Thanksgiving prayer of Paul's letters and the kind of programmatic function it had in letters. And then we looked at what the rhetorical handbooks say about the exordium or prooimion of speeches. And guess what? The thing that you do in a speech at the very beginning in the prooimion or the exordium is you introduce yourself and you try to project a really good ethos character. And then you introduce very briefly the topics that you're going to be talking about in the exordium. And then there were other parts of the speech that had very good analogs in letters. Speeches and letters are not exactly the same. In fact, they are different. But many of the organizational principles that you see in speeches, which is what we call dispositio or arrangement or taxis, a lot of that does seem to carry over in letters. And so the arrangement of a speech is one of the five parts of rhetoric. Invention, namely the use, usually we think of that as the use of topics. Arrangement, style, the smaller bits and pieces of style. And then the other two parts of rhetoric are memory and delivery. And so we began to look at that in great detail in the 80s and especially in the 80s and 90s. although I personally haven't stopped. Um, and so we began to see things um, in these letters that we did not see before. Because what we did was when we looked at the rhetoric of the letter and when we can really identify the rhetoric of the letter, you not only identify the available means of persuasion, as in Aristotle, but you then are able to look and identify the content of what is being persuaded. And when you can identify both the means of persuasion or the form, and then you can also identify clearly the content of a letter, then you really understand the letter and you really fundamentally understand what Paul or some other writer was doing by writing that letter and sending it. Okay. One of the things that I did not really think of when I was teaching full time in the Caribbean is that, and I came to see it later when I came back to the United States, and that is that the New Testament is a collection of collections of writings produced by followers of Jesus. By the way, if Bob Jewett and I are correct in our Corinthian book, then the New Testament is a collection of collections of collections. In other words, the Corinthian letters are a collection of Pauline letters, which are then part of the Pauline corpus, which is a collection. And then, of course, um, the Pauline corpus is that extremely interesting part of the New Testament, which is a collection. So the New Testament has to be looked at as a collection of collections of collections. Um, and the earliest collection of writings in the New Testament is the Pauline corpus. And of course, the earliest part of the Pauline corpus is the authentic letters of Paul, the letters of Paul that we have no doubts about their Pauline authorship. And so that predates the Gospels. Um, and so Paul is the earliest writer in the New Testament. Um, if Bob Jewett's chronology is correct, then he became an apostle shortly after his experience of the risen Christ, which would be shortly, probably in the year 33, 34, that sort of thing. And then the letters that we have are mostly written between 50 and 60 CE. And so the Gospels were being formulated probably at an oral stage. Maybe bits and pieces of it were written, but I don't think that I would date the earliest Gospel, which I believe to be Mark. I would not date Mark in the form that we have it before 70. So um, if you're interested in the earliest church and the early church, and you're interested in Jesus, for example, or you're interested in early congregations, you really have to study the New Testament. So if you could go on to the next one. And so when we study the Pauline corpus, or as my German colleagues refer to it as the Corpus Paulinum, to use the Latin term, um, we conventionally divide it into several groups. The letters that are undoubtedly authentic, in other words, they are undisputed as to their authorship, are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. There is really no serious argument against their Pauline authorship. Now, I would agree that 1st Corinthians 14:33b through 36 is an interpolation. And I also believe that Romans chapter 16, verses 17 through 20 is an interpolation. And then you have three letters that are have been much debated, and those are the three most debated letters as to their authorship: Colossians, Ephesians, and Second Thessalonians. And then there is not that much of a debate anymore about the pastoral epistles. There is some debate, but not a major debate in our guild. And two of the pastoral letters are very much like each other, and that's First Timothy and Titus. And then the other one, Second Timothy, is is quite different. And then, of course, at the very end of the Pauline corpus is the letter to the Hebrews, which we are quite certain that Paul did not write that. It does not have anything in it that looks like Pauline theology, and it does not have a Pauline literary style. It's got a very different theology than Paul has. So anyway, this is the Pauline corpus. Um, and so by using the term Pauline corpus, we're not saying whether Paul wrote any of them. It's a neutral term. Pauline corpus simply means the letters, the documents that circulated under Paul's name, whether or not he wrote them. And then if we can go on to the next slide, you can see that we know a lot about rhetoric in the Greco-Roman world. Um, Only 5 to 10%, probably closer to 5% of people could read and write. And that meant that they had been to school. And so the normal sequence of education had three parts: grammar for all students, rhetoric for many students, and philosophy for relatively few students. Um, in the 90s CE, Quintilian, the greatest Roman teacher of rhetoric, is complaining that grammar teachers are actually trying to teach some of their students rhetoric, and he does not think that they should be doing that. But uh, Rhetoric, of course, is the art of persuasion, and Aristotle said that it was the art of finding the available means of persuasion in any subject whatsoever. And so Aristotle's book, The Art of Rhetoric, Techne Rhetoricae, is the most important Greek book on rhetoric. And it certainly, by the time Aristotle wrote, it rhetoric was already old. And then if you go on, the next question is whether Paul really knew or used rhetoric, or whether Paul would have wanted to use rhetoric. Um, Scholars are very divided on this point, but many scholars do believe that Paul was trained in rhetoric. Can you go to the next slide? Um, and it's also possible that Paul picked up rhetoric without having been formally trained, but the likelihood is that Paul really did learn rhetoric. And I think um, the only way you can find that out is by knowing the tradition of Greek and Roman rhetoric and reading Paul's letters. And the more you know of the traditions of Greek rhetoric, and then you start reading Paul's letters, you really understand that Paul is trying to persuade his readers of something. And so, you know, that doesn't mean that Christian writers did all the same stuff that pagan writers did, but nonetheless, when you see connection after connection after connection in Paul's letters, then you begin to think that this is not just happenstance. There is some intentionality in Paul's use of methods of persuasion. Now, if you could go on to the next slide, you can see that St. Augustine had a Roman rhetorical education, and he had a job in North Africa as a municipal teacher of rhetoric. And in his book, De Doctrina Christiana, on the teaching of Christianity, perhaps, book 4 is a Christian rhetorical handbook. And he actually said twice that Paul's letters flowed with both eloquentia, eloquence, and sapientia, wisdom. And that was already a traditional phrase to denote an ideal rhetoric. And in that passage, in De Doctrina Christianity, book 4, he actually says it and then he repeats it. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see the different parts of the speech. The Greek terms, I'm putting them in Latin. I'm putting them in the Roman alphabet rather than in Greek. But prooimion is the beginning of a speech, and that becomes exordium in Latin, and it's the intro to the speech. And then the diegesis is the narratio, or narration of the speech. Possibly you could call it the statement of facts. By the way, in the preface to the Gospel of Luke, the writer of Luke says that many have put together diegeses, narratives of the things that have happened among us, apparently referring to gospels or something like gospels. Then in Latin rhetoric and also in Greek rhetoric, there was the partitio or propositio. And in the partitio, you actually have the things that you are going to talk about in the probatio, and you say, I'm going to talk about this and this and this and this. And therefore you divide your speech, your proof into partes. And that's the reason it's called the partitio. The other way of doing it is having a propositio, where you more or less state a thesis and then argue that thesis. Um, and then in the main part of the speech is the probatio, or the pistis. Pistis is the Greek word that means faith. And the pistis of your speech is whether your argument really holds water. And in Latin rhetoric, the probatio was divided into two parts, the confirmatio and the refutatio. Confirmatio is where you argue your case, and refutatio is where you argue against the case of your opponent. And then the final part of the speech is the epilogos, which becomes in Latin the peroratio, which is it does two things. You have the recapitulation of the parts of the speech of the things that you argued, and also the appeal to the emotions. And when Quintilian wrote in the 90s CE, he said that the peroratio is the sixth part of the speech. And the reason he could say the peroratio is the sixth part of the speech is because conventionally by this time, the probatio was divided into the confirmatio and the refutatio. And so that is how you can have the peroratio being the sixth element of the speech in the arrangement of a speech. So these terms were used in Greek rhetorical handbooks. The young 18-year-old Cicero brought a bunch of them into Latin when he wrote his handbook called De Inventione. And then he wrote many other works about rhetoric, including Brutus and Orator, and especially De Oratore. And then the major exponent of the full flowering of Latin rhetoric was Quintilian, Marcus Fabius Quintilianus, in the late first century. So the rhetorical tradition is a very involved and complicated tradition, but it does have some very interesting areas of overlap with New Testament letters. Not every part of a letter is in a rhetorical speech, but most of them are, actually, we think. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the arrangement of First Thessalonians, and this comes from an article that I wrote that was published in 1990 in Raymond Collins's collection, The Thessalonian Correspondence. It was in BETL volume 87. And so there I argued that you had an exordium, you have a long and beautiful narratio from 2:1 to 3:10. Paul also writes a long and wonderful narratio in Galatians. And then you have a partitio, and then you have a three-part proof, 4:1 through 8, 4:9 through 12, and 4:13 to 5:3. It's a three-part proof. And then that is recapitulated in the peroratio, and then there is an interesting exhortation, and then final greetings and blessings are in the end of that letter. And so that article was entitled The Rhetoric of First Thessalonians. Now, if you go on to the next slide, you'll see what I did before I worked on First Thessalonians. I worked on Second Thessalonians. And so here you can see that I divided Second Thessalonians, look on the right, You have an exordium in 1 through 12, where Paul introduces himself to the audience. Um, or it's not really by Paul, but anyway, then you have 2, 1 and 2, where the topics of the probatio are introduced, where it says, "Don't listen to anybody by a letter as from us, a letter seeming to be from us that says the day of the Lord has already come." And so in 2, 3 through 12, he has a rhetorical proof where he argues that the day of the Lord has not already come, because here are the things that have to happen in order for the day of the Lord to have come. See? And then you have in 2:13 through 15, um, a little bit more traditional kind of proof, in that you kindly hang on to the traditions that you've received from us, that kind of thing. And then that's recapitulated in 2:16 and 17. And then you have in 3:1 through 15 an exhortation. And of course, exhortations are a traditional part of letters. And then at the very end of the letter is the epistolary postscript, where you have final greetings and blessings. And so, what I was able to show in my book, which was published as this book, um, Early Christian Rhetoric and Second Thessalonians, I argued that if you looked at what was argued in the proofs, and then you looked at how the rest of the speech, rest of the letter looked, you know, moved toward the proof, and then how that was recapitulated. And then when you combine that with the exhortation, that you could really get a handle on the exhortation. You could really get a handle on the rhetoric of Second Thessalonians as a whole. And of course, using traditional historical criticism and drawing on the important work of William Wrede in 1903, he wrote a book called Die Echtheit des Zweiten Thessalonischer Briefs, the authenticity of Second Thessalonians, and it was published in Harnack's series in 1903. And he actually did a kind of a synoptic parallels between, the the text of First Thessalonians and the text of Second Thessalonians, and he showed that the writer of Second Thessalonians drew on First Thessalonians as a literary source, and yet the rhetoric of the letters is really different. In First Thessalonians, Paul says the day of the Lord is going to come like a thief in the night, which means there won't be any signs preceding it. Whereas in Second Thessalonians, in 2, 3 through 12, there are signs that have to take place before the day of the Lord comes. So, what Wrede argued in 1903, and I think correctly, is that in order for the writer of Second Thessalonians to have so many parallels with First Thessalonians, they either have to be, the writer of First Thessalonians has to be the same as the writer of Second Thessalonians, namely Second Thessalonians has to be written by Paul, but they would need to be written, unless Paul kept a file copy, they would need to be written in close proximity to each other chronologically. But the closer you put them in time, in chronology, when you see that on the one hand, many of the words and phrases are used in Second Thessalonians, and yet the theology of the coming of the day of the Lord is just kind of the opposite in Second Thessalonians, then that makes you think that the most likely explanation is that Second Thessalonians used First Thessalonians as a source, a written source, and yet was willing to, um, use some of the apocalyptic features of it, but yet the center of it is 2, 3 through 12, where he argues rhetorically that the day of the Lord hasn't come, because there are evil teachers who are saying, with letters coming as if they were from us, Paul, see, to the effect that the day of the Lord has already come. And so I argued that that really does not make it likely that Paul would have written Second Thessalonians. And then in the latter part of this dissertation, I argued in a chapter called Second Thessalonians as a Deutero-Pauline letter. I looked at the theology of Colossians and the theology of Ephesians. And in Colossians, in 2 13 through 15, 2, wait a minute, 1 13 through 15, 1 13 and 14, just before the Christ hymn in 1 15 through 20, the Christ hymn says, and the thing that precedes it in verses 13 and 14 says that we're already up there with Christ in heaven and that our salvation is already accomplished. And that is quite different than what you read in Paul's own letters. And so, Colossians seems to be a pretty good candidate for a letter as from Paul that says or holds that the day of the Lord has already come. And then the writer of Ephesians also used Colossians as a literary source, or the other way around. There is a little bit more apocalyptic ideas in Ephesians than Colossians. But I think in Colossians in particular, it's a very consistent Gnosticizing Pauline view, namely, salvation has already taken place, and it's a type of Gnosticism, you could say, in that the salvation has already taken place, and by writing Colossians, now the reader of Colossians is made to know we're already up with Christ in heaven. And therefore, since we're already up there with Christ in heaven, our salvation has taken place. And then later he can say, do not touch. Why do you follow earthly rules? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. These are earthly rules. But if you are risen with Christ, then seek the things which are above where Christ is. So Colossians seems to be a very good candidate, the best candidate for those who say by a letter as from Paul that the day of the Lord has already come. And Ephesians is not far away from that. So anyway, that became a book. And so this book was published in the JS&T supplement series in January the 1st, 1989. And so it was volume 30 in that series. So it's still in print. You can buy it. You can buy a digital copy or you can buy a hard copy of it. And so it was cited in New Testament introductions such as the one by David Barr, and also it was cited and responded to in the New Testament introduction by Raymond Brown. So not everyone agrees. Not everybody is willing to make Second Thessalonians a Deutero-Pauline letter. More conservative scholars, more conservative people who are more conservative than I, want to preserve as many of the Pauline epistles as they can as being by Paul himself. And they'd probably like to preserve Hebrews as a Pauline letter if they could get away with it. But nobody seriously has gotten away with that since Vatican II. Um, so, um, this sort of shows you how New Testament scholarship has proceeded in those years. And I would tell you that I don't think that I've been refuted. And then later, a good friend of mine of happy memory, Karl Donfried, and he and Johannes Beutler of the University of Frankfurt uh, published a book of essays called The Thessalonians Debate. And then one of the chapters of my dissertation was called The Rhetoric of Letters. And that's where I show you how the rhetoric of letters seems to work. And then I wrote another paper that I presented in his S&TS seminar that was called The Social Situations Implied by Rhetoric. And two essays of mine are in the Thessalonians Debate, and this came out with Ehrman's in 2000, and it's still available as print on demand. So there's a lot that's been written about Thessalonians. Of course, Glenn Holland wrote a dissertation at the University of Chicago also arguing in favor of Deutero-Pauline authorship. And so there has been quite a bit of debate in the 80s and 90s about the Thessalonian letters.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Frank Hughes.
You're very welcome. Well, I haven't really thought that much about Thessalonians. Um, one of the things that I did in the dissertation is like pages, 3 through 71 of the dissertation was the history of scholarship on the relation between First and Second Thessalonians and the authorship of Second Thessalonians. And I translated a bunch of stuff in it. I translated the appropriate paragraphs of Hugo Grotius from the 1620s, who reversed the order. And I translated a whole bunch of other scholars from French and German. And I decided when I wanted to publish this dissertation as a book, I wanted to give them a manuscript they couldn't turn down. I wanted to give them a manuscript that was like 200 pages or less. And so no one advised me to do this, but I took out that long chapter on the history of scholarship because I thought everybody's going to be bored with it. And so I took it out, and then I wrote a new first chapter from Germany. And so I have regretted that ever since. But nonetheless, Second Thessalonians, I think, takes its place in the Pauline corpus as a letter that has something to do with Paul, but is not a letter that is likely to have been written by Paul himself.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.